Picture this, tucked between grease-stained pages of Betty Crocker's picture cookbook, there lie holiday recipes that once ruled America's tables, and then quietly slipped away. Tonight, we pry open the dusty vault to resurrect 12 lost wonders, jiggly gelatin rings that sparkle like stained glass, candle salads that glow like literal candles, popcorn ball ornaments that smell of sugar and cinnamon. In a 1977 Betty Crocker do-ahead edition, there's a ribbon mold recipe layered with raspberry, orange, and lime gelatin, plus cream cheese and pineapple. Store no longer than 3 days, it warns. And in Betty's own test kitchens, so simple cranberry gelatin salad was once recommended as a holiday staple, lemon gelatin, cranberry orange sauce, set in a ring mold to dazzle dinner guests. These aren't just weird relics, they were mainstays. They were sold as festive conversation pieces. And one by one, they fell from grace. Over the next 20 minutes, we travel through time, rediscovering flavors, textures, and holiday dreams you've never tasted. Let's revive the odd, the elegant, the over-the-top, and find out which of Betty's bizarro classics should haunt your next holiday table. So picture this, a glossy, jewel-toned ring on the table, lime green, creamy white, and ruby red, wobbling under the lights like edible stained glass. That was the ribbon gelatin salad, a mid-century showpiece that turned boxed gelatin, canned fruit, and a smear of cream cheese into a holiday centerpiece. Betty Crocker's do-ahead pamphlets and mid-century recipe collections promoted this exact vibe, layers poured, chilled, and unmolded to applause. The mold looked fussy, but the truth was it was marketing genius, maximum drama with minimal effort. Start with the anatomy. A firm fruit gelatin base, raspberry or lime was classic, a soft middle, cream cheese whipped with drained canned pineapple or marshmallows, and a final clear or colored gelatin top that trapped fruit chunks like confetti. The trick, one vintage recipe bluntly warns, is timing. Each layer must be chilled until thickened but not fully set before the next pour, or the whole thing collapses into a sad slush. That stepwise patience is why these molds were equal parts science experiment and theater. Why did America fall so hard for wobbly salads? Instant gelatin democratized a technique that used to be technical and expensive. By the 1930s and 1950s, Jell-O cookbooks and corporate pamphlets were teaching homemakers how to build color, texture, and convenience into one package. Gelatin molds signaled modern domestic know-how. You didn't have to bake, you could still impress. During rationing and economic squeeze points, boxed mixes stretched ingredients and made dessert assembly unbelievably easy, a cultural perfect storm for the ribbon salad to rise. But the salad's rise included its downfall. By the 1970s and 1980s, shifting tastes, health concerns about processed foods, and a culinary turn toward fresher, less processed ingredients nudged these mold wonders into the retro bin. Still, pockets of the Midwest and communities with strong potluck traditions preserved these recipes. They never truly vanished, they just became a nostalgic curiosity, sometimes revived with adult twists, boozy molds, or modern tweaks to texture and sweetness. Think of a recipe designed to delight children and confuse adults, a peeled banana thrust upright through a pineapple ring, crowned with a maraschino cherry and a dab of mayonnaise or whipped cream that pretends to be wax. That's candle salad, a theatrical, mid-century American fruit salad that first appears in print in the early 1900s and enjoyed its heyday from the 1920s through the 1950s and 60s, showing up in children's cookbooks and community recipe collections. Construction is absurdly simple and intentionally performative. Arrange a few lettuce leaves as the base, set a canned pineapple ring on top for stability, stand a peeled banana upright in the ring, then spear a maraschino cherry on the tip with a toothpick. Many vintage versions call for a dollop of cottage cheese, mayonnaise, or whipped cream at the banana's base to glue it in place and to mimic dripping wax. Older recipe cards explicitly recommend canned pineapple for sturdiness and assembling right before serving so the banana won't brown. Why did households love it? In a word, spectacle. Between the rise of canned goods, commodity bananas, and marketing that celebrated convenience, candle salad let homemakers turn pantry staples into a whimsical centerpiece with almost no effort. It was kid-friendly, it appears in several children's cookbooks, and scaled easily for parties and potlucks, a perfect cultural product of product-driven, mid-century domestic life. Modern audiences react differently. Food writers and online communities have pointed out the salad's unintentionally suggestive silhouette and its odd marriage of fruit with mayo. Yet candle salad survives in memory, sometimes mocked, sometimes lovingly revived at retro dinners, and occasionally adapted, strawberry yogurt wax, cottage cheese swaps, to make it less eyebrow-raising and more appetite-friendly. Close your eyes and imagine Christmas in 1948. The radio hums with Bing Crosby, the air smells of pine and coal smoke, and from a polished dining table drifts the rich aroma of something dark, dense, and steaming, plum pudding with hard sauce, one of the most beloved and enduring symbols of the holidays in both Britain and America. This wasn't a Betty Crocker invention, but by the mid-20th century, her cookbooks helped keep the centuries-old tradition alive in American homes. The 1950 Betty Crocker picture cookbook proudly featured plum pudding under holiday favorites, describing it as a rich steamed dessert fragrant with spice and fruit, perfect with a buttery sauce. It represented elegance, heritage, and a touch of old-world nostalgia in an era obsessed with convenience. Despite the name, plum pudding contains no actual plums. The term plum once referred to raisins or dried fruits, ingredients that symbolized abundance and festivity. The pudding itself was a heavy, moist mixture of breadcrumbs, flour, eggs, brown sugar, suet, or shortening, and an orchestra of spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and allspice, all bound together with molasses and brandy. Once mixed, it was steamed slowly for hours in a pudding mold, wrapped in cloth, or sealed in a basin. The process was long, deliberate, and filled with ritual. Every family member was often invited to stir the batter and make a wish. Betty Crocker's 1950s recipe was slightly modernized for the American kitchen. Instead of beef suet, she suggested shortening or butter, and she replaced the traditional dark ale or stout with sweet cider or fruit juice. But she kept the essence intact, the deep color, the rich scent, and the ceremony of unveiling it at the table. And then came the crowning touch, hard sauce, a creamy, boozy butter sauce that melted luxuriously over the hot pudding. In early editions of the Betty Crocker's Cookbook for Boys and Girls, 1957, the sauce is listed simply as sweet butter sauce, made by creaming butter with powdered sugar, a dash of vanilla, and a spoonful of rum or brandy if you were feeling bold. Some homemakers even whipped it until fluffy, storing it in the refrigerator until the big reveal. For many Americans, plum pudding wasn't just dessert, it was theater. When carried to the table, often still steaming, it might be flambéed with a splash of rum, the blue flame flickering like candlelight across smiling faces. It was the centerpiece of memory, a dessert that spoke of ancestry, of endurance, and of Christmases that valued ritual over rush. By the late 1960s, though, the pudding's long cooking time and heavy ingredients began to feel outdated. Lighter desserts like chiffon pies and gelatin rings took over the holiday spotlight. Still, every so often, a nostalgic cook brings it back, and suddenly, the kitchen smells like a Victorian Christmas again. Step into a 1950s Christmas party, the kind with tinsel garlands, satin dresses, and punch glasses that shimmer beneath the glow of a silver tree. At the center of the table stands a crystal bowl filled with rhubarb punch, chilled by a frozen masterpiece, a cranberry ice ring. It wasn't just a drink, it was mid-century art in a mold, a shimmering, edible wreath that floated like a jewel. In the 1959 Betty Crocker party book, the cranberry ice ring punch appeared as a centerpiece idea for holiday entertaining. The recipe was part beverage, part decor, a visual showstopper that reflected America's obsession with theming every holiday detail. The ice ring itself was mold in layers, often using a bundt pan or ring mold, frozen with slices of lemon, orange, mint leaves, and fresh cranberries. As it melted slowly in the punch bowl, it released both color and flavor, keeping the drink cold while perfuming it with citrus and tart berry notes. The base punch varied with the decade. In the early post-war years, hostesses used cranberry juice cocktail mixed with ginger ale or lemon-lime soda for sparkle. Some recipes from the Betty Crocker Hostess Cookbook, 1967, added pineapple juice or orange concentrate for sweetness and depth. Others, especially those from community cookbooks, spiked the punch discreetly with rum or brandy for adult gatherings, though the official Betty Crocker versions always stayed family-friendly. The cranberry ice ring became a holiday essential for one simple reason: it turned thrift into glamour. With just a few common ingredients and a ring mold, homemakers could impress guests with a custom-made sculpture that seemed luxurious but cost only pennies. It embodied the 1950s ethos, making beauty out of the everyday. A good hostess wasn't just feeding guests, she was creating an atmosphere. Yet, this punch wasn't without challenges. If the ring melted too fast, it could dilute the punch, freeze it too hard, and it wouldn't release from the mold. Betty Crocker's tips, printed in several editions, warned to dip mold quickly in warm water and slide gently into punch to avoid splashing. Those precise instructions were part of the era's charm, domesticity as choreography. Culturally, the Cranberry ice ring punch reflects America's shift from formal, sit-down meals to casual, buffet-style gatherings. The punch bowl became a symbol of shared joy, an open invitation for guests to mingle and refill, laughter clinking through glass cups. It was sociability made liquid. By the 1970s, though, the ice ring's reign faded. Pre-mixed sodas, bottled juices, and the disappearance of formal entertaining slowly erased it from the holiday scene. Today, a few vintage enthusiasts still revive the tradition, their punch bowls ringed with frozen cranberries and mint leaves, their kitchens echoing the laughter of another time. Imagine this, it's the day after Thanksgiving, 1956. The dining room smells faintly of gravy and nutmeg, and in the kitchen, your mother, in her crisp apron and perfect curls, is standing over a Betty Crocker cookbook, spooning something creamy and rich into golden pastry shells. It's not pie. It's turkey à la king, a once luxurious, now forgotten dish that turned leftovers into elegance. In the 1950 Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook and later in the Betty Crocker Hostess Cookbook, 1967, turkey à la king was celebrated as a fancy but frugal recipe, an ideal way to stretch the holiday bird. Its origins trace back to the late 1800s, when chicken à la king was first served in New York's upscale hotels. By the mid-20th century, Betty Crocker's test kitchens had adapted it for the American home, swapping chicken for turkey during the holidays and suggesting it be served in puff pastry shells, patty shells, or over toast points. The dish was simple yet rich, diced cooked turkey folded into a velvety cream sauce made with butter, flour, milk, and chicken stock. To that base came mushrooms, pimentos, and sometimes green peas, adding both color and texture. Betty Crocker's 1950s version emphasized presentation. The sauce was ladled into delicate pastry shells that stood proudly on fine china. It was domestic glamour, a way to make thrift feel like luxury. In post-war America, homemakers took pride in recipes that looked fancy enough for company but used what they already had. Turkey à la king fit that image perfectly. Advertisements from the era often showed it served in silver chafing dishes at buffet tables, a centerpiece that turned practicality into prestige. Serve warm and garnish with parsley, the cookbook instructed, as if that final sprinkle could transform leftovers into a banquet. The cultural meaning ran deeper than taste. Dishes like this represented the optimism of the 1950s, a time when abundance was returning after decades of war and rationing. Women were told they could have it all: convenience, beauty, and refinement, even from a pot of reheated turkey. The pastry shells themselves, often sold frozen in supermarkets, symbolized the new age of ready-made convenience that Betty Crocker championed. But as decades passed, the dish fell victim to changing tastes. The heavy cream sauces of the 1950s gave way to lighter fare in the 1970s, and the idea of encasing meat in pastry began to feel old-fashioned. By the 1990s, turkey à la king had vanished from most tables, remembered mostly by those who grew up watching their mothers pour it steaming from a saucepan into those golden, flaky cups. Today, reviving it feels almost cinematic: buttery pastry, creamy sauce, and a hint of nostalgia that brings warmth to the table. Now picture a 1950s living room, its Christmas tree aglow with colored bulbs, tinsel glimmering, and, if you were lucky, a few homemade ornaments you could actually eat. These weren't sugar cookies or candy canes. They were popcorn ball ornaments, a sweet, sticky, and slightly chaotic holiday craft that defined mid-century Americana. In the 1959 Betty Crocker Party Book and the later Betty Crocker's Cookie Book, 1963, popcorn balls were presented as both decoration and dessert. They were the perfect blend of family fun, kitchen chemistry, and sugary spectacle. Kids could help pop the corn, while parents handled the boiling syrup, a hot, bubbling mix of sugar, corn syrup, water, butter, and sometimes a splash of vinegar for that glossy, glass-like shine. When poured over freshly popped corn and quickly shaped into balls, the mixture hardened into chewy, crunchy clusters that could last for weeks, or until temptation struck. Betty Crocker encouraged homemakers to tint the syrup with food coloring for festive flair, red and green for Christmas, orange for Halloween. For holiday gatherings, some recipes suggested threading a ribbon through the top and hanging them on the tree as edible ornaments. Popcorn balls make bright, merry trimmings, one 1960s ad read, and they're twice the fun when guests can eat them, too. It's easy to forget that popcorn balls weren't just cute, they were practical. During the post-war years, when processed candies were expensive and home sugar work was still a point of pride, this recipe turned an affordable pantry staple into something magical. It required no oven, no molds, and no special tools, just quick hands and plenty of buttered fingers. They were also a throwback to earlier American traditions. Popcorn balls date back to the 1800s, when farm families used molasses syrup to bind corn together for winter treats. Betty Crocker's versions modernized that rustic idea with corn syrup and bright colors, turning old-fashioned resourcefulness into mid-century fun. The experience of making them was as important as the final product. In the Betty Crocker's Boys and Girls Cookbook, 1957, the instructions were simple but charming: have a big bowl of popped corn ready. Pour syrup carefully and stir fast. Butter your hands and shape the popcorn into balls before it cools. Then wrap each one in wax paper for friends. For kids, this was holiday magic they could hold, homemade candy that came straight from the heart. But as convenience foods took over in the 1970s, the homemade popcorn ball faded away. Store-bought candy, microwavable popcorn, and ready-made ornaments replaced what once was a cherished family ritual. Still, in nostalgic kitchens across America, some people revive the tradition every December, a kitchen dusted with powdered sugar, sticky fingers everywhere, and laughter echoing through the room. Imagine sitting down to a polished 1950s holiday table, the turkey perfectly carved, the stuffing warm, the candlelight soft. And then, there it was, a bowl of ruby-red relish glistening like a jewel, sending up an aroma that promised sweetness and delivered a kick. This was cranberry relish with horseradish, one of the boldest dishes ever to grace the pages of Betty Crocker's new picture cookbook from 1961. A sharp, sweet, and fiery creation that proved mid-century cooks weren't afraid of flavor. At first glance, the ingredients read like a dare: raw cranberries, sugar, horseradish, and sometimes orange zest. No cooking, no simmering, just chop, stir, and chill. The Betty Crocker Holiday Cookbook described it as a sparkling companion to roast meats, meant to cut through the heaviness of turkey and gravy. It was a revelation at the time of a cold, raw relish that combined the tartness of cranberries with the sinus-clearing bite of horseradish. The contrast was so surprising that many first-time tasters couldn't decide whether it belonged with the main course or on the dessert table. In the 1940s and 50s, America's palate was shifting. Housewives were experimenting beyond the sugary jams and jellies of their mother's generation. They wanted dishes that looked elegant, tasted exciting, and could be made ahead, a trifecta that Betty Crocker's test kitchens understood perfectly. Cranberry horseradish relish checked every box. It was stunningly colorful, lasted for days in the fridge, and required zero stovetop effort. In her cookbooks, Betty Crocker even suggested molding it into a decorative ring shape and serving it on a platter of lettuce, an instant showpiece for the buffet table. The secret to its success lay in balance. The sharpness of the horseradish made the tart cranberries taste livelier, while a bit of sugar smoothed out the bite. Some versions added crushed pineapple or a splash of lemon juice to mellow the flavor, and the truly daring used freshly grated horseradish root instead of the jarred kind. It wasn't subtle, it was meant to wake up the palate. Over time, though, the dish's punchy personality fell out of favor. By the 1980s, softer flavors ruled holiday tables. Cranberry sauce became sweet and jelly-like again, while horseradish was relegated to roast beef sandwiches. Yet, those who remember it still talk about that first taste, the zing, the freshness, the way it brightened every bite of turkey. Today, food historians and nostalgic cooks are rediscovering it, often pairing it with smoked ham or roasted vegetables. It's a recipe that refuses to be tamed, a spicy little reminder that mid-century cooking wasn't all jello molds and mayonnaise. Close your eyes and imagine winter in 1940s America. Frost gathering on the window panes, the faint sound of Bing Crosby on the radio, and in the kitchen, a mother whisking something that looked almost too magical to be real, snow pudding. This delicate, cloud-like dessert once dazzled post-war dinner tables, a symbol of elegance and thrift rolled into one. It was light as air, shimmering like fresh snow, and yet made from some of the simplest ingredients you could find in any pantry. The earliest records of snow pudding date back to the late 19th century, but it truly gained fame through Betty Crocker cookbooks in the 1940s and 50s. As refrigeration and electric mixers became more common, home cooks embraced recipes that showed off these new conveniences. And nothing showcased the magic of gelatin and egg whites quite like this one. At its heart, snow pudding was pure simplicity: lemon juice, sugar, gelatin, and beaten egg whites. The mixture was whisked until it formed soft, glossy peaks, a process that required patience and a touch of skill. Once chilled, it transformed into a light, wobbly foam that quivered like freshly fallen snow. But it didn't stop there. Betty Crocker often recommended serving it with a custard or vanilla sauce, poured over the pudding just before serving. The contrast of cool, airy sweetness and warm, creamy sauce made it unforgettable. What made snow pudding so special was how it reflected the spirit of its time. During and after World War II, many ingredients were rationed: butter, cream, and sugar were precious. Housewives had to make do, and snow pudding offered elegance without extravagance. It was a dessert that looked luxurious but cost almost nothing: no fancy equipment, no exotic flavors. Just creativity, care, and the magic of transformation. Betty Crocker's 1945 wartime cookbooks described snow pudding as a delightfully light dessert to finish a hearty meal. It was often served at church socials, bridal showers, and Christmas dinners. Children loved it for its jiggle and sparkle, adults admired its refinement. In an era when gelatin desserts were all the rage, snow pudding stood out for its purity and simplicity: no canned fruit, no artificial colors, just snow-white beauty. As decades passed, however, this ethereal dessert slowly vanished from American kitchens. By the 1970s, heavier, richer sweets took over: cheesecakes, layer cakes, and chocolate mousse became the stars of the show. The delicate charm of snow pudding faded into memory, remembered only by a generation that grew up when simplicity still carried grace. Today, a few vintage dessert enthusiasts are bringing it back, appreciating its elegance and nostalgia. It's not just a recipe, it's a reminder of a time when Americans found joy in turning the ordinary into something magical. There's something timeless about the Yule log cake, or as Betty Crocker proudly called it in her 1950s holiday cookbook, the bûche de Noël. This wasn't just dessert. It was centerpiece art, a symbol of festivity, craftsmanship, and pure mid-century holiday magic. In a world where post-war America was discovering joy again, this cake rolled its way into hearts and homes across the nation. The Yule log's roots stretch far beyond American kitchens. The tradition began in medieval Europe, where families would burn an actual log, the Yule log, during winter solstice celebrations to welcome warmth and good luck. By the 1800s, French bakers had transformed that ritual into a dessert, a rolled sponge cake filled with cream and decorated to look like a wooden log. When Betty Crocker adapted it for American homemakers in the 1940s and 50s, it became an instant holiday hit. Her version simplified the European classic but never sacrificed its charm. A light, airy chocolate sponge was baked in a jelly roll pan, spread with fluffy whipped cream or mocha filling, and gently rolled up. The outside was coated in rich chocolate frosting, then barked with a fork for texture. Some home bakers even added meringue mushrooms or powdered sugar snows to complete the forest fantasy. In the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook, 1950, the recipe was introduced as a Yuletide showpiece that brings sparkle to the Christmas table. It embodied everything that 1950s America adored: presentation, precision, and a sense of wonder. Housewives took pride in crafting this cake not just as food but as art, the perfect blend of French sophistication and Midwestern heart. But behind the frosting and beauty lay practicality, too. The Yule log cake could be made from scratch or with a boxed mix, appealing to both the ambitious baker and the busy mom. For a generation experimenting with convenience foods, this cake struck a balance between tradition and modernity. It felt elegant yet approachable, a dessert that made every home feel a little more magical. Over time, though, as American desserts leaned toward quick fixes and simpler bakes, the Yule log faded from the everyday holiday table. It was replaced by pies, cheesecakes, and later, instant desserts that required no rolling, no patience, and certainly no fork texturing bark. Yet for those who remember it, the careful rolling, the sweet smell of cocoa, the satisfaction of cutting into that perfect spiral, it remains a holiday masterpiece that deserves revival. During the Great Depression and wartime years, Betty Crocker's mock mince pie became a thrifty miracle, a dessert that delivered the rich, spiced flavor of traditional mince pie without the expensive meat or suet. Housewives used crushed crackers, apples, vinegar, and warm spices like cinnamon and cloves to mimic that deep, hearty taste. The 1942 Betty Crocker cookbook described it as economical yet festive, a pie that fooled guests at the Christmas table. It symbolized American ingenuity, stretching every crumb into comfort. Each bite carried the illusion of luxury in an age of scarcity, making it one of the most beloved imposters in vintage baking history. A far cry from today's quick and sides, Betty Crocker's green bean almondine casserole was once the epitome of elegant simplicity. Introduced in the mid-1950s, this dish combined tender green beans with buttery almonds and a splash of lemon, offering a lighter, more refined alternative to the heavy cream-based casseroles that dominated the decade. It was often reserved for holiday feasts and Sunday dinners, its glossy green beans shimmering beside the turkey or ham. Featured in Betty Crocker's Holiday Cookbook of 1959, it reflected post-war America's growing taste for European-style dining, proof that even vegetables could be glamorous when touched by Betty's golden spoon. Few desserts capture the joy and imagination of mid-century Christmas like Betty Crocker's holly wreath cookies. They weren't just cookies, they were edible ornaments, tiny green wreaths dotted with red cinnamon berries that shimmered on holiday tables across America. Simple, sweet, and impossibly nostalgic, they first appeared in Betty Crocker's Christmas cookbook during the 1960s and quickly became a seasonal sensation. These cookies reflected the playful spirit of post-war America, a time when homemakers embraced color, creativity, and a touch of whimsy in their kitchens. The recipe was charmingly straightforward: marshmallows, butter, cornflakes, a splash of vanilla, and green food coloring. The mixture was warm, sticky, and fragrant, shaped by hand into little rings before being decorated with bright red candies. Kids loved helping make them, turning the kitchen into a joyful mess of laughter and melted sugar. Betty Crocker described them as a simple touch of Christmas cheer that brightens any cookie tray, and she was right. They became symbols of togetherness, the kind of treat families made side by side, passing bowls of melted marshmallow around the table. And though they weren't fancy, they carried a powerful sense of nostalgia, embodying what the holidays were really about: connection, creativity, and a sprinkle of joy. But as the decades rolled on and homemade holiday baking gave way to store-bought convenience, these colorful wreaths quietly disappeared from most kitchens. Still, for those who remember them, the smell of warm marshmallows, the sticky fingers, the laughter, one bite brings it all back. The magic of simpler times. To all my viewers, tell me this: where are you watching from, and which of these vintage Betty Crocker holiday recipes have you actually tried? I'd love to know your thoughts, your stories, and your memories. Maybe you've seen your grandma make one of these, or perhaps you've tried recreating it yourself. Whatever your experience, share it in the comments below. We should keep these stories alive, together, swapping memories, sharing experiences, and keeping the spirit of vintage American cooking from fading away. Also, let me know, which recipes do you want to see in the next video? Drop your suggestions in the comments, and I'll gather all your ideas to create another beautiful and nostalgic journey through America's forgotten food history. Thank you so much for watching. Love, respect, and goodbye. See you in the next video.